So, thank you, friends, for joining us for our grant need workshop with Dana and our guest speaker today, Jason Smith. So, as noted, please pop your questions into the chat box. Jason, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and get started. And thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to you and JL for the work that you do. And it's a pleasure to see you all here this morning. As Melissa mentioned, I am a Chief of Fiscal Policy and Analysis and also the Grant and Aid Coordinator for the Office of the Controller General. And what that is basically our office provides nonpartisan support to the state's Joint Finance Committee and also the Capital Budget Committee. And for grant and aid purposes, the Grant and Aid Act is written by the Joint Finance Committee. So I do have a short presentation, which we'll kind of go through this morning. I also am prepared to show you kind of some new changes that have been happening to the grant and aid process. And of course, answer any questions, any burning topics that you'd like to delve into further is fine by me. So I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully everybody can see that, and we will keep going. So just a little brief back history on grant and aid and what it is. I mean, it looks most of you I think are already probably familiar with grant and aid, but so those of you who are a little new or new to what the program is, grant and aid is more commonly known as GIA, and it is an appropriation that our General Assembly has made for over 80 years. And it is intended to support the activities and programs of nonprofit organizations that provide services to Delaware citizens. One kind of caveat with grant and aid, it is subject to the availability of funds. Typically, whatever funds are remaining from the operating budget and the capital budget are allocated to grant and aid. So the annual Grant and Aid Act is an additional funding source for many different things. Beyond the community agencies, it also provides supplemental funding for public ambulance and fire companies, the county seats, also supports the paramedic program operation, and it also funds over 400 nonprofit community agencies in the state, senior centers, and veteran service organizations. And it's also a grant funding source for local law enforcement agencies throughout the state as well. So just to give you an idea of how much funding we're talking about here, I know there's a lot going on this graph, so don't feel like, I hope it's not too overwhelming, but I tried to change it up from what I kind of had before. But this chart is kind of intended to illustrate the overall grant aid funding that's been appropriated over the last 5 years, broken out by section. Each bill lists the appropriation amounts for the various sections and the titles of which you'll see towards the bottom of the chart there with the government units, senior centers, one-times, etc. Funding wise, the Act has appropriated about $70 million over the past 2 fiscal years. Last year's grant and aid bill, fiscal year 24, was actually the largest in the state history. It was providing almost $72 million in funding. And you'll probably notice, obviously, from the chart, from the blue and yellow sections, those are where the funding is appropriated most towards, which is sections 1 and 2 of the bill, which are government units, which include senior centers, and then the various community agencies as well. And community agencies make up about 32 million of the bill. So, I mean, I know this gives Melissa some heartburn every year. We talk about, how the one-times and the government units don't necessarily provide funding to the nonprofits, but and unfortunately that is just kind of how the General Assembly has used the bill in terms of that. But the community agencies is, I think, what we're most focused on. So why is grant and aid unique? The General Assembly has 3 or 4 annual appropriation bills. It kind of depends on the year. There's definitely always an operating bill and a bond budget bill, and sometimes there's a one-time supplemental act, which will provide funds as well. So the grant and aid bill is really the 3rd or 4th major spending bill that the General Assembly does every year. However, this program is different because the funding doesn't come from the operating budget. There is an application and allocation process that is done independently of the executive branch. Grant and aid is totally a legislative function, so that in that sense makes it unique because there is not really necessarily any input for the allocations from the executive branch on that side. So what agencies are eligible to apply? There's a lot here. I'm certainly not going to read it to you. This information is also available on our website. But just to give you a kind of a summary here, eligibility for agencies that apply for grant and aid is defined through what's known as epilogue language, which is written in the annual GIA bill. And these requirements, again, can also be found on our website or also in any of our application guides, which I'll show you in a little bit. One of the essential requirements for an organization is that they are incorporated and operating for 2 years before applying for and receiving grant and aid. And the organization should also have a 501c3 nonprofit status, although we do have some organizations that are 501c status in another category, but primarily the committee does like to see 501c3 status if possible. Some other notable requirements here is that an agency have bylaws, a volunteer board of directors, competent staffing, facilities, accounting procedures, and a recent audit. And then the other big thing is that really the agencies need to make sure that they're using the funding in accordance with their application and also being able to apply online by the due date every year. So now that we've kind of went over about who's eligible, let's talk about a little bit what grant and aid funding can be used for. And it's such a wide variety of wide variety as Melissa knows, nonprofits serve a variety of communities and throughout the state. So really there's a variety of unique programs and services that are provided in the grant and aid bill. So there's not necessarily an exact list of what funding can be used for. The Grant and Aid Act does specify that funding is intended to be used for programs that are unduplicated by other state agencies and satisfies an unmet human need in the community. But overall, the intention of grant and aid funding is to provide supplemental funding to agencies to support programs or activities for services that impact and benefit Delawareans. So really, there's a lot that can fall under that umbrella that can be really tied to what grant and aid funding can be used for, which is good in a sense because it allows a lot of flexibility for what agencies can request funding for. So while there's not necessarily a defined list of what grant and aid funding can be used for, there is a defined list of what grant and aid cannot be used for. Section 6 of the Grant and Aid Act kind of defines these things, and it cannot be used for things like child daycare, can't be used for the purchase of capital equipment, moving, renovating or purchasing a building, paying for any part of an elected official's salary or benefits used for political campaigns or political purposes, lobbying services, or for programming for individuals that do not reside in Delaware. So the grant and aid process is pretty consistent every year. This year we had a little bit of a snag because we were a little delayed in launching our new grant and aid system. Typically our applications run from September 1st to December 1st each year for our general and veterans group, but for this year they're running from October 1st to December 1st. We actually just opened yesterday. We've already got some organizations registered and some applications received. So everything seems to be working good on our new system end, which we're really excited about. I'm really excited to show it to you in a few minutes. So there's basically 3 types of applications that we accept. There's the general veterans application and also the senior center applications. General and veterans, of course, as you see, is accepted in the fall, and senior centers are accepted in the winter. Our entire application process is handled electronically through our online system, which you can get to from our grant and aid website. It's basically gia.delaware.gov. We've tried to make that as simple as we can. So on this website, which you'll see screen grabbed here on the left, and I'll show it to you a little more detail in a few minutes. There are some various resources available here for applicants to be able to assist through the application process. We have general, veteran, and senior center application guides, which are step-by-step guides that will allow you to walk you through how to submit an application. the covers of which you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And there's also a guide that contains step-by-step instructions for how to register for a new account. There's also frequently asked questions. You can find the qualifications for grant aid on there, and you can also find Controller General staff contact information. And then we also have what's called an LIS, a Legislative Information Systems Help Desk, which is available to applicants who have experienced issues with the My Delaware login process, but which thankfully has gotten a lot smoother over the years. We had a rollout about a year or two ago, which didn't go quite so smoothly, but it has gotten a lot better. So hopefully you won't need that, but it is there in case you need it. So just to also give you an idea of our staff here on our office, each member of our office is assigned a particular grant and aid category or categories. Our staff is always available to you if you have any questions about an application or you need assistance during the application process or any other inquiries that you may have. You can reach out to us at any time. This contact information that you see here, these are our direct office lines and our email addresses, and Melissa will be sharing that out, so you'll have that. If you're unsure about an appropriate category, or if you just also have a general grant need question, you're always welcome to contact me. I'm always happy to assist anyone that I can. I kind of love talking about grant aid because it's actually one of the more rewarding pieces of my job. So I'm always happy to have a conversation with anybody that wants to have one. So the application review process is, once these applications are received by our office, as I kind of mentioned to you a moment ago, they are assigned a grant aid category, and they're assigned to a controller or general staff member. And then each one of these categories is assigned to a team of 2 legislators from the Joint Finance Committee. So typically in the spring, the Joint Finance Committee co-chairs will meet and they will come up with guidelines for these team members to be able to start to review the applications and to be able to make funding recommendations to the committee. And the guidelines are essentially like how much overall funding is available. And then the team members are trying to, balance the requests with what's available and how many applicants are there and what types of programming, that they are interested in providing for. So once those teams typically meet, they meet usually in the spring, like April or May. Their goal was to make funding recommendations to the full committee so that the full committee is able to meet and vote on a grant and aid act, which is typically done towards the end of June. So, and then in addition to a review process, our staff also tries to do site visits annually to a variety of organizations so that we can observe the in-person activities and programs to try to get a better understanding of applications. My thought process is always like, it's one thing to read it and see it on an application, but oftentimes meeting someone in person or touring a facility or kind of getting a better understanding really helps us, because when we're sitting there with the team members that are making the funding allocation decisions, sometimes we get questions on the fly about, what does this mean, or, where are they located, things like that. And we try to answer the best that we can. So the more educated we are, the more that, we can advise them. And, we're not necessarily we're not approaching it necessarily from an advocacy standpoint, but we are trying to present it to them in the full knowledge so that they can make, a funding decision, because those typically, as Melissa knows, they go fast once they start meeting, and not just for grant and aid, for all kinds of things. The time that they meet is limited, and they are often making decisions very quickly, come May and June. So and then just to kind of wrap up this slide, the Senior Center application review process that's in place by the Joint Finance Committee uses the University of Delaware's Institute for Public Administration for advice on a senior center funding, which is based upon an evaluation methodology and distribution formula. So as I kind of just went through, the Joint Finance Committee does make decisions regarding grant and aid in late June, and the committee will release a bill for consideration by the General Assembly. Historically, the bill has been the final appropriations bill that's been enacted by the legislature, usually on June 30th. Then once the bill is enacted, our office will issue electronic award notices to the community agencies and then transmit the award information to the state treasurer's office so that they can begin their issuance process. So generally, organizations awarded funding under $6,000 will receive a one-time payment towards the end of July, early August, and then amounts over $6,000 are issued quarterly once in July, October, January, and April. So as I mentioned, that was a very kind of brief overview. I know that I'm sure there are lots of questions out there. So I don't know, Melissa, if you think we should do some questions first or before I show you the website, or how would you like to do that?
So can I add a few things from the advocacy perspective? So
Absolutely.
Jason gave a great overview of from the Controller General's office, the steps in the application process and what happens with the Joint Finance Committee. Now, looking at this from the applicant perspective, and I want to be very clear, like the application is a step in the process. It would behoove any applicant to grant and aid to do their due diligence and to reach out to those members of the Joint Finance Committee that are reviewing their particular areas. So as Jason noted, members of the Joint Finance Committee are assigned to those areas. And as many of you have heard me say over and over and over again, it's really important that you follow up and advocate to those members so that they understand how important the work that you're doing is to the community and how the money will be spent. So you are probably not using the money to go on a shopping spree, unless it's like completely related to your mission. So perhaps this was a bad example, but you know, it's really critical that they understand how the money that you are asking for is serving the community and meeting your mission, and what are the outcomes that you are trying to provide. If you have data that shows how you have been impacting the community thus far and how this will amplify that work, that's also very important. So I do think that, you know, thank you, Jason. That was incredible in terms of the process, but that clicking send on your application is where the work of a nonprofit starts. So then your work has to continue in terms of advocating for that funding. And that, to Jason's point, if your application is due at the end of 2023 or the very beginning of 2024, you have 6 months of work to do to advocate for that funding. And you have to be obnoxious practically in order to really, like, you know, continuously be advocating so that they understand. Leverage the folks that you're serving and your volunteers, and perhaps come to an advocacy training if you need some help on this. So I do want to just share that this is like a critical piece of the process, but it is one component of how you really get to the point of receiving grant and aid funding. Jason, can you speak to if you are a recipient of grant and aid funding, then what? Is there reporting that needs to happen in terms of an audit requirement? Or could you speak to, like, what does an organization have to do in order to be initially eligible or to report on the dollars that they've received?
Sure, absolutely. So, and just to kind of add on to a little bit to your point too about the advocacy piece before I delve into your other question, you know, you make some really good points. You absolutely do need to advocate with members of the committee and members of the General Assembly. One thing I will add to that too is that typically, and I probably should have mentioned this in the presentation, is that newer organizations, those who have not received grant and aid funding in the past, typically the JFC co-chairs are kind of the gatekeeper of determining whether or not those new entities are allowed into the grant and aid bill. So if you are a new organization, it definitely is in your interest to try to get on their radar, because they're the ones that are going to definitely be making the decision as to whether or not funding is allocated for that. And that can also come through other members of the General Assembly. So if there's someone that you already have an existing relationship with, or somebody that you know in a caucus that you know you're comfortable with speaking to, they all do communicate to each other, and they all do definitely trickle down into our office. So you know, it's definitely just, you know, as Melissa said, you definitely want to communicate and push to them, because they are ultimately the deciders in this. So so having said that, now moving on to Melissa's question about like reporting requirements and things like that, grant aid is probably one of the easier grants that from a nonprofit standpoint that you could get, in the sense of there's no follow-up required with it. There is some initial things on the front end that have to be done, and there is a requirement for an audit done within the past 3 years. However, there is a lot of flexibility with that in some senses, because there is a recognition that not all organizations are large enough to be able to have, you know, funding available to do an audit. So there is an opportunity to say in the application process, if your organization can't afford one, or it's too cost prohibitive, or it's going to take away from your ability to provide the services that you're, you know, trying to do as part of your mission, you can certainly state that in your application, and the Joint Finance Committee takes that into consideration. But there is no follow-up requirement reporting or things like that. It does probably serve you in your best interest from a metrics perspective to be able to track what you're using your grant aid or what your outcomes are, because when you submit a request for the next cycle, you'll be asked to provide updated information about, you know, the number of people that you're serving and things like that. So it will be in your best interest to kind of know that, but there is no official documentation or reporting requirement once an allocation is provided. So I hope I answered that question, because I feel like I kind of forgot a little bit after I rambled on after you
So I
talked.
want to just be really clear, because officially an audit within the last 3 years is required, but if it's cost prohibitive, you can indicate that.
Yes, so the Grant Aid Act specifies that there is a requirement of an audit completed within the last 3 years. However, if there are circumstances that prevent you from providing an audit, which typically for most agencies it's a cost issue. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, for some it can be as much as, you know, $7,000 to $10,000, probably more, for the cost of a full audit. So you know, and if you're an organization that only is, you know, has less than, you know, 50,000 in revenues or smaller, obviously that's going to be an issue. So you can just say that in the application. There's an opportunity to, you know, state that in the process, and the Joint Finance Committee takes that into consideration. So it's not, an application won't get kicked basically if
Right.
there's not an audit attached. We look at the circumstance.
Mark, I see your question, but just one quick note, Jason. One thing that I do want to share, just for the good of the order, if you will, is that we are finding in the last 2 years that audit firms are having a hard time hiring, and they've increased costs between 25 and 30% for audits to nonprofits, because they're shrinking down their nonprofit audit business lines. And so it's becoming very difficult to find an audit firm, and the cost for those audits has gone up a lot. So that could be something worth revisiting with the General Assembly, given that there might be something else that is worth exploring in lieu of an audit. So, but worth a discussion. For our nonprofit friends here, I know that many of you have been in these conversations where an audit has been very difficult to acquire. It's incredibly cost prohibitive right now, but it is an important financial control component. So yeah, something worth having a conversation about. But Mark, I see that you have your hand raised, so I'd love to ask you to unmute, and we want to address your question.
Sure. Hi, Jason. Mark from the Newark Partnership here. Kind of along these same lines, I think I have an answer, but I just want to clarify. We're a 3-year-old nonprofit. that has budgeted, I think $15,000 to get an audit this fiscal year. We're currently pricing that out. We've done our due diligence in our tax reporting so far. We have up-to-date 990s. We work with Dingle and Kane in Newark to get everything on the up and up. If we're in the process of getting an audit, how does that work with our application? Should we just say we're in the process of getting an audit now? Is that going to hinder us? Is that going to help us?
Yep, you can basically just state in your application, and I can show you in a little bit what the application will actually ask you. But there basically is a question that says, "Are you attaching an audit to this application?" And because your audit's not complete, you can just say no, and then a pop-up box is going to come up and ask you to provide a circumstance for why you can't provide an audit, and you can just indicate that that audit is in process. If it's completed before the end of the application process, you can always attach it to your application. You can also send it to me, down the road, even after the application period is closed. Typically, that does not impact the overall review of an application from the committee standpoint. I will say, and to Melissa's point, I mean, because we've spoken about this before, about the costs, really I think the overall intention is there are a lot of nonprofits. I mean, the majority of ours are smaller, and they're, smaller shops, and there are larger ones that are, out there, bringing in millions in revenue. And I think that's the balance that's hard to strike. So I don't necessarily ever foresee the committee saying we're going to totally get rid of an audit requirement, but I do think that there is flexibility there for those who are in a situation where it's not operationally, it just doesn't make sense. So, I don't want that to discourage anyone from, submitting an application. I think, it certainly is valid to put in an application that there is not, we just don't have the operational capacity to spend on the cost of a full audit. And, there's organizations too that, maybe have set, 5, audits that are, 4 or 5 years old and have just said, it's just, it's something we're doing, but it's taking us a little longer. And, we totally understand that too. So just from an application standpoint, it will not, prohibit your application from moving forward, any kind of message or indication like that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So before we jump into, look at you guys using the chat box. It's so amazing. So Jason, we have another question about how do you determine which members of the Joint Finance Committee are reviewing the category which your organization is applying?
So our office actually doesn't make the determination. It is totally a decision of the JFC co-chairs, and it can change, and we've had some turnover on the committee, so I actually expect that there will be changes for the next cycle. So when they meet, typically they'll meet for operation budget hearings in February. That's typically when those decisions will get finalized, so I'll have a better sense of who's assigned to who, probably by the end of February, early March. And I'm always happy to share it. We don't necessarily publish a list publicly, but if there's anyone, that reaches out to me or Melissa asks, I'm certainly happy to let them know or let you know.
And to be fair, friends, JL and I shamelessly ask. So when we are aware, we will happily share that information out with the collective. So Jason, you don't have to share that, but we do. So other questions that we have here in the chat box. Previously told organizations that haven't previously received grant and aid can only receive $5,000, and that asking for more is frowned upon. Is that accurate?
So typically the committee has used kind of this $5,000 threshold for entities that are put in and on a new basis, almost like I don't know if they're, for lack of a better word, like a trial run, so to speak. So first year, they typically, if they do allow an allocation, they'll provide like 5,000 and then kind of see how that goes. And I think that's because there's some hesitation on their end to provide, a huge allocation to a new organization that they might not necessarily be familiar with. There is no rule that says you can't ask for more. I always tell people, I would ask for what you think is reasonable and what you can justify. If you were to meet with them in a face-to-face, meeting, what would you feel comfortable asking for? I don't think that there's necessarily a limit there if you feel that what you're trying to accomplish for your organization is needed. So I, like I said, not a hard and fast rule, but it is kind of in practice what the committee has done. And I think that kind of goes along the line. I saw a question from Kate that I think we missed too, that said, our project costs are high, relatively speaking, are there recommendations of appropriate monetary asks? And, like I said, I always just kind of tell everyone, don't be afraid to ask for what you need. Obviously, I don't know that I would come in, if I were in your shoes, I don't know if I would come in asking for, $1 million, because I think sometimes for a new nonprofit, that can be a really hard ask, unless there's, some kind of project that's justified in a member's district. But, I would say ask for what you feel comfortable with. There's really no harm in asking, and, you never know what the committee may decide.
Jason, can I ask, so friends, I see that there are questions, but I have a question related. So we'll come back to the ones in the chat box in just a moment. Jason, are there rules around overhead?
There is no specific rule around overhead. I will say that in practice, I think the committee has said that they have hesitations about providing funding that goes purely to overhead or to salaries or things like that. That being said, it is difficult for some organizations to not have that because, for example, an agency that provides maybe like, counseling or substance abuse services, you're relying on people to do those functions. So in that instance, you're likely going to have, grant and aid costs totally supporting positions. I think that what has caused hesitation in the past is that there have been organizations that have come in and asked for, I want a position to do X, Y, Z. And I think that has caused some heartburn in some instances. So I always tell folks to try to frame it in the context of what program or what service you are providing, and then what do you need to provide that service or program. If it is a person, then, obviously it is that. But I would frame it in the context of what overall program or service your ultimately goal is trying to achieve.
So I'm going to rephrase that so that, because this is something that I've heard in the rumor mill, if you will, right? And it's become like this pervasive concept that there is. So if you were to submit for a program and a percentage of that program ask was overhead, because you have to keep the lights on it in order to keep the program running, that would not be kicked back simply because it had an overhead component to it.
Right. It would not be kicked.
Okay. I want everybody to hear that. Again, this is like one of those myths that I hear a lot. So just bear that in mind.
Can you repeat that thing that we need to remember?
I'm going to say it louder. Well, the thing, Mark, was that you? Because the thing that you have to remember is as nonprofits, you are in fact allowed to lobby. So that's the thing that you all have to remember. But that's not the topic for today. Not the topic for today. Mark was in a different training that I hammered away on. But that you at Grant and Aid, you are not restricted from adding overhead costs to your application. There is no restriction. What Jason is saying is you shouldn't submit your application for the total application for overhead costs. So Grant and Aid typically is not general operating support. That is not something that the Grant and Aid Committee or the Joint Finance Committee prefers to fund, but that as a percentage of your programmatic support, you are permitted to include overhead in that. Now, will they fund it? I don't know. It's a pretty subjective process. So that's also something to bear in mind, that Jason can't say this, but I can. This is a subjective political process. So that's where the advocacy component is important. And that there is an important piece of the puzzle where you have to educate. These legislators are really good people, but they're not the subject matter experts that you are. So you have to really help them understand that like overhead is an important component of the work you do as a nonprofit business. And that in order to support a program, there is a cost to keep the lights on and to cover staff salaries to a degree and to pay health insurance. And there are overhead costs that come along with operating a business. So just something that I want everybody to bear in mind. So you are permitted to add overhead as a percentage of it's not restricted. Just what Jason is saying is don't submit a general operating request. That's probably not going to work out so well for you. So is that what I heard, Jason? Am I being fair?
Yes. No, you're right. I think, if you're submitting just an application to provide overhead funding, I think the committee's going to look at it and they're going to say, no. I think they're gonna look at it in terms of what kind of service or whatever is being provided, and then what piece of that are you using as overhead? Because that's understandable. Again, you have that need. You have to, have a, operation behind you in order to do it. So
that's right. That's
right.
Understandable. So next question, Jason, because we love picking your brain as a sector. Is there a preference for applicants' 501c designation or a historical trend of what types are more often to receive grant and aid? Is it weighted? So I think the question is asking is, are you required to be a 501c3 designation?
So there's not a requirement that says you have to be a 501c3. There are rules state that you have to be a nonprofit, which I believe kind of had in the past was trying to encompass that whole 501c umbrella. Mm-hmm. And on a somewhat related topic, because this has also been new, while we're not here to talk about community redevelopment or reinvestment fund, which is the capital grant side for nonprofits, there is a requirement on that side to be a 501c3. So having said that, just, if you're interested in establishing or creating a nonprofit, that might be something that you want to, keep in mind. But from the grant and aid side, there is no rule or preference. We really just look to see, are you operating under that nonprofit umbrella, under that 501c designation. And as far as for the second part of Chris's question about a historical trend of what's often granted, I don't have like statistics, or I've not really ever delved into that offhand. But I would say probably offhand, most of our organizations are 501c3s, probably 70-80% of them are 501c3s, and then I think others fall under different categories depending on what they are. But there's no real like weight to one or the other. The committee looks at them all the same.
Great. So Jason, the next question, I do want to add a little context because our friends here are all nonprofits that are likely applying to funding to corporate funders and foundation philanthropic supporters. And one thing that I know that I'm hearing from those organizations is that they want to see organizations in collaboration with one another and bringing requests as a collaborative. So is that something that the Joint Finance Committee is interested in seeing? Like, can 501c3 organizations come and apply together as a joint effort?
That's an interesting question. It's not something I've ever really heard or had posed to us. So I'm not really sure how the committee would necessarily respond to that or feel about that. Historically, all of our entities that receive an allocation have come, singularly, meaning they've just applied to us for their specific program or service. Mm-hmm. So I don't necessarily know how to answer that. I will say that the committee does have a rule about using fiscal sponsors in the sense because they didn't want to see another organization taking an overhead fee and as a pass through to another organization. So I'm not really sure, necessarily what that would look like, but that would be an interesting conversation, I think, to have. So I don't know if I can answer that fully right now.
But I think it's like I mean, open to discussion, right?
Yes.
Awesome. I love that. Erica, did I capture your question accurately?
Yes, you did. And what you said is
Okay.
exactly why I asked it.
Oh, sure. We're hearing it. I write grant applications too, so I understand. And then, Jason, is there a minimum or a maximum funding amount that, the committee feels in a comfort zone?
We have an entity, I think, that gets $2,000, and we've got somebody that gets like 1.3 million. So there's quite a range. So I don't know that there's really there's no rule or there's no, nothing that says, what can be asked for or what can be provided. And so it really can just be, it's really unique depending on the organization.
Okay, great. So, Jason, I think that we've answered all the questions for the moment. And I know that there's like an eagerness to see what you have to share with us in terms of the platform. So is it okay if we make that transition?
Absolutely.
Super. And I know everybody's really excited that I'm going to be clicking the mute button.
I will share my screen again. So this is the Grant and Aid homepage, and you get to this webpage by going to gia.delaware.gov. And this is kind of the landing page that you'll get to. And this is where all the information that you'll see that you'll need in order to register or be able to view an application guide. You'll see there's a review and registration system guide link here, and there's application guides here. We also are providing, because it's a new system for us this year, we're doing live virtual demonstrations, but you're actually getting that now, so you don't really necessarily want to probably waste your time. But before you begin, and I'm encouraging this to everybody because there is a component to My Delaware in order to access the grant and aid system. And we've changed things slightly a little bit as far as what is asked for on the front end. And what I mean by that is when you complete a registration process, there's a page in here that kind of tells you things that you're going to need to know in order to finish your application process, efficiently and in one sitting, or your registration process rather. So that would be your organization's legal name, your EIN, date of incorporation, and then either general phone number, address, and mission statement. Those things are going to be needed in order to start and do your registration process. So I definitely encourage you to, review the registration guide before you get started. And then once you're ready to get started, and again, these are all in the application guides to this step. So, I'm probably going to go too fast, but, I'm trying to slow down. But basically, when you get to this page and you're ready to go, you'll click on this graphic and you'll land at our grants management system page. And if it's your first time registering, you would basically click the applicant registration screen. It's going to ask you or tell you that you're going to be redirected to My Delaware to initiate a registration, and then you will be taken to the My Delaware screen. If you already have a My Delaware account, which if you've already applied for grant and aid in the past, I think 2 years, you will already have this. You can just sign in with your existing My Delaware username, and you would be able to get to that. If you don't have a My Delaware account, you will click the green sign up button here, and you'll just go through the steps in order to create an account. And that's all. The step-by-step is outlined in our user guides. So I won't bore you with that necessarily, but let me get you logged in here. This should be a good one. So what's going to happen is once you've created your My Delaware account and you get access to the system, you're going to be brought to this screen, which is going to ask you to register basically your organization that you're representing. And there's 3 options here. There's the nonprofit 501c3 option, the other 501c3 tax exempt organization, or if you're another organization type government entity. Most of you, I believe, will be in this nonprofit 501c3 bucket. So you would click that. The system is going to ask you if you're applying for funding as a fiscal agent on behalf of another nonprofit. Your answer should be no. If your answer is yes, it's going to tell you you're not eligible. So you're going to click no, and you're going to be brought into the next screen. And then what this screen is that it actually allows you to search for your organization. If you know your EIN, this is linked to an IRS database, which will basically bring up all of that information for you. Or you can also search by city and state. You can search by the name. You can search by the address. And basically, however you search, if you enter in your EIN, it'll come right up. But this is all of the nonprofits that are registered, in Dover, Delaware. So just for an example purpose, when you search for your EIN and your organization comes up, you would just click it, and it's going to bring you all that information from that database into the rest of the registration form. And then this is where, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to need to know like your date of incorporation and your mission statement in order to complete this registration. So I'm not going to, and if you want to go back, you can search again, or however, whatever is easiest for you. If your organization is not a 501c3, you would basically just start either at another 501c tax exempt, or if you're a non-501c status, you would hit submit, and then you're going to be brought to this screen where it's going to ask for your organization's legal name, and you would type in your legal name, and then it's again going to bring you back into this form that we just saw, and it's going to ask you for your EIN, date of incorporation, phone, address, that sort of thing. So I'm not going to complete this, unfortunately, because I don't want to tie up anybody's EIN, but I will log in with another account so I can show you what it'll look like once you actually log in. Bear with me here. It's like not letting me out of the cycle for some reason. It won't be this difficult, I promise. This is just because I have to show from a different account once you're like logged in. So bear with me, but we're moving. So once you got through that registration process and you've successfully registered, you'll land at this homepage screen. And this is where basically you will start your application process, and you can view available funding opportunities. As you can see here, there are 2 funding opportunities currently available, one for Grant and Aid General, one for Grant and Aid Veterans. It talks about what it actually is, when your submission deadline. And so when you're ready to apply, you would click the one that you're interested in applying for, and it's going to go through what the program details. And a lot of this information is information that's already available on our Grant and Aid website. These are just the details that are pulled from the bill. And there's other reference guides and materials here. This is all the same stuff that's on our website, but just again presented to you. So if you decided that this is the one that you want to apply for, you would click apply for funding opportunity. And then it's going to ask you another short question. Has your organization been properly formed and operating for 2 years? Because this is a requirement for grant and aid. You'll click yes. And then it's going to ask you if you intend to use it for any of these purposes, because these are prohibited. You would click no. You've passed and you hit proceed. And now you're ready to begin. You're in the application. So for those of you who have applied in the past, you may remember that there were tabs on the left-hand side that kind of detailed these: general, management, revenue, salary, expenses, programs, and summary. These are the same type of functionality for this system. You would just navigate through your various tabs and you're going to input the information. The system has instructions on each page, which shows you basically what you need to do as you go through. There's definitely little instructions and guides along the way, and our user guides also detail, things that you'll need to fill out as you go through each one of these tabs. So the general is basically pulling all the information that you have already entered when you did the registration process. One additional question here is, are you a first-time applicant? This is not, again, prohibiting you from applying or anything like that. It's just something we're trying to track so that we know, how to present that to the committee. One cool thing about the system that has changed for hopefully the better, many of our organizations would like to have multiple people be able to work on an application, and this system provides you with the ability to do that. Once an initial contact is registered for the organization for the first time, they're kind of acting in that gatekeeper role so that they can control who else is associated with their organization. And you have the ability to add collaborators from your organization. You may have to invite them, and the system will tell you how you can do that. And there's also, you can go through and add a contact to be able to associate it to the application. So that's a very cool feature that I'm excited for a lot of our larger organizations. I know Easter Seals and Boys and Girls Club and some of the others, I think, like to have multiple people associated because they all like to get their subject matter experts to kind of talk about their various pieces. So that is, I think, going to be a useful feature for a lot of our organizations. So as you kind of go through and finish, each tab, you'll go through, the management tab. These are very similar to how they were on our previous applications. It's going to ask you for the physical location of your organization. As I mentioned during the presentation, we like to do site visits. Sometimes those where you're actually located can be different from your physical organization address. So we just ask to differentiate that here. We also ask for where your agency is actually providing the services and days and hours and things like that. Key contacts, the application is going to ask you to input directors and officers of your organization. You're going to need to have at least one. This would be for your board and like for your executive director or whoever, are considered key personnel for your application. So when you're ready to input those, you would just add under each column there, and you fill in the information that's been requested. So that would complete the management screen. On the revenue screen, basically we're asking for an overall revenue idea of what your organization is bringing in. When you're ready, you would click the Add Edit Revenue key, and then the instructions will tell you how to input these things. And basically you would just go through each section, and if it's applicable to you, you would put in the information. Not everybody's going to have everything in this bucket or in these buckets, but it's there in case it is applicable to you. One thing that is, I think, a little different than previous years for our system, what you're asking for in grant and aid is going to be inputted in your proposed year. So if you're asking for, say, $25,000 overall, you would actually input that in, and the system is going to compare that with an amount that's added in your programs field, which I'll show you in a minute. There's an opportunity to add if you have any other grant funding from the state, such as Community Reinvestment Fund, funding from the Division of Arts or Division of Small Business or any other state of Delaware agency. You would add that here, just input what it is and the amounts. If your organization already has existing contracts with state agencies, you would also add that here and the amounts. Some agencies receive settlement funds from either the tobacco master settlement or the prescription opioid settlement. You would indicate that here. Federal government funding, any block grants and pass-through grants, non-state government grants would be entered here. And all of these are defined also in our application guide. So if you're, trying to determine what necessarily would fall into these blocks for you, you could find further definitions in our user guides for what we're looking for here. Once you've inputted everything, the system will total it up and it will allow you to basically be finished with this tab. It'll reflect here. And then you'll be ready to keep moving. And the other thing too, don't feel like you have to do all this in one sitting. You can, leave and come back to it. You can save it, because some of this information may not necessarily be readily available. As you move through, you'll get to a salary screen. It's going to ask you if your agency has positions that earn salaries greater than the threshold shown above, which in this case is $75,000. If you do, the system is going to ask you to input that information. If you don't, you would just provide a total overall salary cost, and that will change based on the answers to your questions here. So the system is pretty, it's a lot more intuitive than what we've used before. I see Mark has his hand up. I don't know if that drew a question or.
I did have a quick question about salary,
Sure.
if you don't mind. Does that include like benefits as well, or are we talking about just annual salary?
Just annual salary. Benefits are in a different line in the expenses,
Gotcha.
Which I'll show you in a second. But yeah,
thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yep. In this case, you would just be looking at your salary versus the salaries. So as you move through expenses, or as you move through the tabs, you would come to the expenses tabs, and it's kind of the same concept as the revenue tab. You're adding in, the expenses here. Here's where you would see the benefits line that Mark was just asking about. You would just count your benefits separately outside of the salary, and other operation expenses as well. Not everybody's going to have these, so not everything has to be filled in, but it's there in case it's helpful to you. And then other sections and subgroups are able to be added as well if necessary. And again, our user guides explain other expenses that you may see in this category, or would define it a little probably better than what I'm doing right now. But the biggest piece that you'll probably be familiar with, if you're familiar with the grant and aid application, is the programs piece. And the programs piece is basically what you're actually asking for funding for. So everything that you have kind of done is led up to this piece, and you're going to actually input what your program is that you're trying to seek grant and aid funding for. So as you go through the screen, it's going to ask you for the population that you're targeting and a program description, other community agencies that may be providing this service. These fields again are defined in the application guide too. If there's I realize they may not necessarily speak to everybody, but like, for example, program objective measure, what that is looking for is what are you using to measure the outcomes of your program? Is it hours of services? Is it number of meals provided? It's different for everybody, but the goal there is to try to understand how you're measuring success basically of your program. As you go through, you would if this is a new program, you'd hit yes. If it's not, it's going to either way require you to add or edit program details. And basically the program details are, for your proposed year, if it's a new program, how many you're serving, what your service measure is, which means how are you measuring your service? Or is it in the number of hours? Is it in the number of meals provided? Is it in the number of trainings provided? Or whatever it is that is unique to your program. So again, these fields are defined, so you have something to reference in the how much of the service measure are you providing? So if you're defining your service measure as, the number of hours, how many hours would basically go into this field. And then like, so there's a lot more information available for you to reference as you go through. Some of these field, Melissa, I saw you unmuted. Did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I actually, we have a number of questions in the chat box. I just wanted
I can't
to,
see the chat box, so sorry.
No, it's okay. No, that's my job. We're good. Okay, so the first is, can an organization have more than one person registered in the My Delaware platform collaborating on the same application?
Yes. So they will each have to register for their own My Delaware account, but whoever is kind of the first to register for the organization will be kind of automatically defined into that gatekeeping role. And then subsequent individuals will need to register as, into the system. And then whoever's in that gatekeeping role can add them to their application as a collaborator so that they have access to the application. Now, I will say that I say this with a caveat because this is a new feature for us. I'm still learning the system. So if somebody actually goes to use it and you're confused or we need to walk through it together, it'll be probably a learning experience for both of us. So feel free to reach out to me and we can go through that process together because it's the first time for us too. So, but that is how it is supposed to work.